Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you. I put a little timer here because I get lost, so you guys would appreciate it if I didn't. I typically talk to technical operations, IT operations, security operations centers about their situations or technologies. I'm excited to talk to a group of investors, traders, and people involved in capital markets because you are uniquely positioned to understand something that most technologists don't understand about security. And that is that security outside of a business context makes little sense, because at the end of the day, the question is, how do you deliver your product, your services, your goods in the most efficient and effective way? And at a core business model, risk and reward is part of how you operate your businesses and your operations. Security is the same. What are the risks? What are the rewards? And how do I protect those things that are essential to me? So let's talk a little bit about the trends this year. This is the legal disclaimer. I'm going to give you 3 seconds to read it. Okay, we're good. Did I just kill that? There we go. Cyber threats, none are immune. The internet has provided instant connectivity across the globe in milliseconds, creating a communication environment that has never existed before. It's really the wonder of the internet. You can do business with someone exactly on the other side of the planet anytime virtually that you want to. The other side is that also makes you exposed to anyone on the other side of the planet or next door, because you're just a click or a ping away from that communication. In 1984, Stuart Brand, who wrote the Whole Earth Catalog back in the 1960s, had a conversation with Steve Wozniak at Apple Computers. And the key part that I highlight there, he's talking about information being expensive because there's so many things that you can do with essential information. And as traders and people in capital markets, you understand the value of information and what you can do in terms of trading and positioning your company for advantage. On the other hand, information wants to be free. And what does that mean? How easy is it to keep a secret in your life? How is it to keep a secret in your organization, in your team, in your company? The truth is that information has a natural entropy. It has a natural, we can observe a natural tendency for that information to leak at some point in time. Information has an age. So we live in an information age where one of the key assets, that information, has a shelf life that in some cases can be measured in milliseconds. And when we're used to protecting our secrets, the key values of our organizations or the key methods that we use to make money in our businesses, that information is highly valuable. There are a lot of people that are interested in it, and the technologies we use obscure or sometimes don't provide the visibility in terms of how that information may move. So it creates a risk in of itself. So between the last 2 years, we've seen significant breaches in government, retail, finance, banking, retail systems. The Office of Personnel Management breach in 2015 was the largest breach in the United States. That was an electronic hack, allegedly by state actors, obtaining 22 million highly detailed records of government employees, including their vetting records for clearances. Then this year we have the manual extraction or exfiltration of key data allegedly from the CIA, having to do with their tactics and procedures and how they do all of the business that you read about in the spy novels you may enjoy. I certainly do. In banking, 2014 and 2015 saw 2 major breaches. JP Morgan's breach of millions of records of key information on their customers in their environment. Highly valuable, highly sensitive, and up to that point, one of the largest breaches in history. And that same year, Anthem lost 78 million records, detailed personal health records from their patients that were part of their entire system. In 2017, we see retail, we see increasing point-of-sale breaches, everything from card skimming to collection of other data at the point of sale from malware being deployed in those environments. And of course, Yahoo got breached for the second time with a record billion number of user accounts that were actually exposed on the internet. And the intriguing thing of that is that the attackers used data from the first breach to execute the second breach. People still hadn't changed their passwords after the first time. And then last October, October and November, we saw distributed denial of service attacks, which attacked the infrastructure of the internet, causing interruptions across the planet as the key domain name services associated with that were interrupted by hundreds of thousands of cameras and IoT devices that had been compromised, executing a tremendous amount of traffic to bring down that infrastructure. What's curious about this type of attack, and it's typically precursor to other activity, is that there was a dry run 30 days previously. So there was a spike. We saw this activity 30 days before the fact, which typically we look at as an indicator that something else is coming. At that point, the dry run attack was the largest attack that had been seen at that point, but it was very short in duration. When Dyn actually launched in November and they completed that, it was the largest attack, causing fairly wide-scale interruptions that affected every business that's represented or that you engage with here at some level or another in terms of interruptions. So in 2011, we had a security analyst look, how do we understand what's happening in kind of the internet threat landscape with respect to attack? How do we visualize it or understand what it means? So he put together this chart, and the size of the bubble is about the size of the impact of the particular attack or the breach that occurred. And then he laid it out over a timeline. And it was sort of an interesting way to understand the Sony attacks that were well publicized due to vulnerabilities in their PS2 and gaming environments were exploited, and they were exploited a couple times over the time of that year. The Valve Steam attack, large gaming platform, compromise occurred at that point in time. But the point is that it gives you a sense that in the same way that if you read papers about banks getting robbed, frauds being perpetrated, the internet is just another environment, another medium in which people execute malicious activity, political speech of various types, and it became a way sort of for us to understand it. Although there was one thing that we observed, if we fast forward to 2015, now we see a significantly higher number of breaches that are publicized, made raising really the awareness of what's happening there, caused by a number of reasons. Does it mean that the number of attacks actually increased? On some level, yes. But the other part it reflects is changing attitudes about breaches and release of information, forced governmental disclosure in some cases, and then companies realizing that the fact that they have an interruption to services or that there's a breach doesn't mean that there's business over any longer. If we fast forward and look at 2014 to 2016, you see the same sort of activity in terms of the density and the number of disclosed breaches happening, the size of those getting larger. And at some point, this chart will not become useful anymore because it will pixelate for the amount of information that's being released about people's information being leaked. So what are the key trends that we're looking for in 2017? Well, there are really four top-of-mind activities. I can't bring my phone. There we go. There are four top-of-mind areas of technology in which we see the largest amount of activity. And in general in the industry, these are felt to be the areas of greatest concern. And from your perspective, the question is, what risks do these represent to the businesses that I interact with? What do they represent to my business? And how might I confront them? The Internet of Things, top of mind. The platform on which the distributed denial of service attacks happened back in November. Changes in insider motivation, insider being employees in an organization, contractors, people that have access to your internal internet resources. Crimeware, the rise of ransomware, we have a number of notable activities there we'll talk about, and then distributed denial of services. So if we think about the Internet of Things, there's much press, everyone's talking about the Internet of Things. What is the Internet of Things? Well, if I have my phone and your phone, this might be considered an Internet of Things, but this is actually a highly sophisticated computing platform. It has a highly sophisticated security infrastructure. It has a control infrastructure. It provides a mechanism to manage an IT system, a set of mobile devices, distributed computing, in a way that is reflective of the way that we manage IT or our infrastructure resources in our organizations. IoT, however, for a camera means there is a computer in the camera, there's an operating system in the camera, and there's an internet connection on that camera, and typically on that, whether it be a camera, or it be a light bulb, or it be your refrigerator, they tend to be dumb devices. They do not have the kind of management, they don't have the kind of authentication, they don't authenticate anything. It's a connection to the internet that something can connect to. Or they may have very weak authentication. The point is you have an explosion of devices now available on the internet with little to no security, which for someone who exploits systems provide a marvelous opportunity to see what you can do with those. And when we talk about crimeware and the criminal nature of a number of types of attacks, the exploitation of those resources to create a virtual cloud infrastructure that is controlled by someone who doesn't own those devices. We've identified and we talk about the 5 undeniable truths of IoT. The first one is devices will operate in a hostile environment. The internet is a hostile environment. How is it hostile? There are hostile actors on the internet that want to do everything from steal your computing resources to use your platforms and your devices for their own purposes. That's just the nature of the world. The challenge in the internet being visibility. If someone comes to your place of business and wants to break in and steal your resources, there are any number of people in your organization that see that. That's why we have a security guard to see who comes in. If there's not a security guard, you have a receptionist. But the point is, in the physical world, we have visibility to the attacks that come against us. In the internet world, we typically don't think about or see how it operates. We don't see all of the communication that happens on the internet or that affects our organization or your home router. Well, the only thing that we see is the applications and the things that we use and navigate on the internet itself. Software security will degrade over time. This is just a truism in any software. You see vulnerability reports that are new vulnerabilities are found and discovered and exploited every day. When we write code, there are a set of practices that we use to build secure code. But when I write code, I happen to be a human being, and I make errors. And sometimes there are errors in judgment, sometimes there are errors in technique. It doesn't matter the source of errors. All of those things are sources of risk. The key is that as a human being, I'm not perfect, number one. And number two, we are building complex systems even in the context of code, and sometimes we don't understand the types of vulnerabilities there are. So as a truism in software, software security always degrades, which is why there always needs to be update as vulnerabilities are discovered. There always needs to be research or a mechanism to monitor the activities of those things to validate that they are operating as you expect and they're not creating security problems. Shared secrets don't remain secret. All of the news reports I put up at the beginning are evidence of that, but nonetheless, we know from personal experience with or without the internet that secrets remain secret until you share it with someone. Weak configurations, one of the largest vulnerabilities historically in the computing industry is bad configuration of services. So part of the exploits in October around the Dyn attacks and the distributed denial of service attacks exploited known configurations, default configurations. You have a set of servers, you have a set of devices that have well-publicized default passwords that are published in the manual. They all say change these, and the number of configurations that don't do that are myriad, and they all provide a platform for somebody to exploit in your environment or somebody else's environment. As well, people make mistakes in configuration of devices and inadvertently create insecure deployments or configurations in their networks that are discovered hopefully before they become a problem, but frequently when those systems are breached. As data accumulates, the amount, the attack surface, we say, the attack surface, the number of things that provide an opportunity or attacks of opportunity increases. The more data you have, the more things that can leak, the more opportunities there are to obtain it. IoT amplifies that challenge to the extent that IoT devices are associated with high-value resources in your environment. Stated maybe more simply, IoT provides a access point. It really creates a broad and new kind of access to resources which we may not understand the significance of, and we'll talk about some ways to think about how to continue to enjoy the advantages of IoT without letting it affect your infrastructure. So in last year's, or this year's actually, the report, Verizon has a data breach incident report they release every year. I commend it to you along with the IBM X-Force trend report. But in that, they identified something that was really intriguing last year, and that was the motivation for insider crime increasingly is espionage, and decreasingly financial motivation. That is, people being paid to steal secrets from your organization or to hack another organization. And this trend is really reflected by the increased visibility to state actors that are using the internet as spy agencies do to gain intelligence and leveraging that significantly. So one of the largest increases in activity we see is the visibility of state actors leveraging the internet for identifying corporate secrets, identifying governmental secrets, and you probably know the names, but if you Google state actors, espionage, IT, you will get a whole raft of reports, information about alleged activities of any government that you can think of on the planet, and there's probably 5 notable ones that come to mind. Cybercrime is fascinating on a number of levels. So what I sometimes ask, and the epiphany for me about cybercrime is typically hackers are described as someone wearing a hoodie and they're in a basement and they're typing away on their machine and they're trying to break into your machine. And they're these single actors, or there's hacktivists making a political statement and they want to breach a website so they can get broad visibility to whatever their message is, etc. And that's the picture that we typically have, but certainly over the last 10 to 11 years we have seen an increasing sophistication and differentiation of what I would call the criminal internet supply chains. There is a clear supply chain that exists that supports solely criminal activity. It starts with a malware or a vulnerability researcher. It may be a 17-year-old that likes to hobby and break things, and it's a fun thing to break software, certainly, if you've ever engaged in it. They will find vulnerabilities in certain kinds of systems. They will write exploits. They will write code that will enable someone to exploit that system. It executes against that vulnerability to obtain information, to obtain access, whatever it might be. They sell those exploits to a part of an organization that that take those exploits, they package them, they market them, they use them to exploit systems to build botnets. And a botnet is simply a unauthorized cloud service that is created from an attacker exploiting systems, controlling those, and then being able to control, as in the IoT case, hundreds of thousands of devices with some fairly simple software that they can deploy instructions to act in certain ways at certain times. Those botnet creators then also partner with criminal marketers, and those marketers take the services that are offered by those botnet herders, and they market those services so you can go in various places, and I'm going to show you a couple before we finish. You can get services to rent a botnet, to execute a distributed denial of service attacks, to take a botnet and turn it into a spam bot to deliver malicious spam messages. Anything you can do in computing, you can do in a botnet in a criminal environment. So if you take the criminal part out of this infrastructure that's created, and you look at it economically, what do you see is a set of actors with differentiated roles and responsibilities in their environment that are running their business. Their business happens to be Crime Inc. It's not different than it was in the 1930s and 40s in the States with the mafia, except now it's deployed on the internet, and there are you can refer to them as gangs, but they're criminal organizations that are well organized, and they run a very smooth and efficient business. As well, one of the intriguing things from a computing standpoint is that the most resilient cloud services that I've observed, and probably the fastest to get to resilient services, is criminal networks. In 2008, 2009, there was a big splash made. Microsoft was getting, Microsoft and Microsoft systems were getting hit by botnets that were running out of a provider called Colo in Colorado. Large malware attacks, large botnets. They observed activity. They had partnered, the FBI had got involved. Together they had done investigation to understand what it was, and they took down those botnets. What they did is they went and they closed that ISP. They cut off the ability of those bots to communicate and get instructions, and they declared victory. And it was actually a major win at that point in time. What wasn't publicized 3 months later is that Colo came back, but it wasn't located in one place any longer. And the second feature of it was that the botnet, if I can deploy a piece of malware on your machine, I can code it in such a way that it will periodically go look for a machine out on the internet to get instructions. Well, what they did after the Colo takedown, and up to that point, primarily you would observe that malware was given an address or a command and control server to access one. When that net was taken down, you had a bunch of bots. We said they were headless. They lost their mind. They couldn't get instructions from mama anymore, and they were useless. Directly after that, the computer scientists in CrimeWare said, you know what? We need to have a distributed command and control infrastructure such that malware today doesn't look one place for instructions. It's actually coded fairly sophisticated way to look across the internet to find a place where it can access. And the idea of taking down a botnet is still true in a certain sense, but the impact of that to Crime Inc., if you will, is significantly diminished because they've created a highly distributed and resilient infrastructure. So what do? Well, you can do any services out in Crime Inc. as you can do anywhere else, as you have CrimeWare as a service. So if you want to launch a spam campaign for ransomware, so you can execute your extortion plans if you're a criminal, not that you would execute extortion plans, they provide a complete service to enable you to do that. Everything from DOSing to spam, 50 to 65% of all malware campaigns, and they're not an incident. As you have a marketing campaign or you have a launch for a new product, it's no different here, right? Except in the criminal, I'm launching a particular campaign to execute malware. I'm going to launch a particular campaign to take down infrastructure so I can do something else or replace it and make it look like I'm that particular person. There may be a whole raft of activities that I want to accomplish in that environment, and I've lost my train of thought, so I'll come back. Illicit marketplaces, we'll talk about that. But what was interesting and top of mind kind of last year is we saw ransomware, and ransomware has been around for 12 years. The first crypto lockers come out. You get an email saying, oh, what I was going to say about spam, quick tag. 55% of those campaigns, think of it as a crimeware offering campaign, right? Has a life cycle. You do the marketing up front, you're going to have the product launch, you're going to have the customer engagement, and this runs for months. This isn't single attack, it's part of an entire campaign. So in ransomware, what a CryptoLocker does is you get common ones is common services. Your bank, it looks like your bank has sent you an email. It looks like PayPal has. Apple says you need to update your account. Everything looks, it's got all the proper logos. It looks just like what you saw before, and there's a reason for that, and that is that it's easy to copy those logos, those letters, those other things, and just repurpose them, which is what happens here. So you get that, there's a link in there that says click here to update your link. You click that link, and what actually happens is it takes you to a server that drops malware on your machine, and while you're engaged in doing whatever you thought you were doing, updating your account, verifying that you're really in Norway and not in Austin, whatever it is, while you're typing and doing that, your hard drive is getting encrypted, and somewhere in the middle of that, you get a little pop-up that says, oh, by the way, your machine is now encrypted, and please send X number of Bitcoins to this address. We'll give you instructions here. Send those Bitcoins, and we'll send you the keys to decrypt your machine. Now, when CryptoLocker first came out, and I saw it in the healthcare industry, where there were healthcare systems that had been infected, they had locked up a significant amount of the infrastructure, and they were asking for millions of dollars, and there would typically be a negotiation in there, but they were asking very high amounts of money to release those systems. And as a consequence of that, law enforcement was typically engaged right away. And when law enforcement shows up in your criminal enterprise, as a criminal, your risk increases, and the difficulty in completing or executing that particular campaign also increases. So what we noticed last year was that the ransomware perpetrators, if you will, started reducing the costs of unlocking the machine. So for individuals that had laptops that were locked, rather than being told you have to get $10,000, $20,000, $100,000 to unlock that, they were charging fees as low as $100 to unlock your machine. What's the reason for that? The reason for that is simple. At about $100, do you call your local law enforcement, number one? And number two, does the FBI or your federal agencies here that handle that kind of crime, do they really care about crimes in the $100 level? No, they deal in risk reward too, and they go for the highest risk, highest value, highest cost crime activity. $100, $200, $500, $1,000, up to sometimes $10,000. They're not really that interested in because they've got bigger fish to fry. So the ransomware met we call the law enforcement demand curve, and they said, at what price can I perpetrate my extortion with the largest number of people with the least amount of law enforcement activity? So they reduced the prices, and suddenly their businesses started to thrive in a new way. Some of you may have seen the attack on the BART system in San Francisco last year. The biggest consequence of that was that BART ended up giving free rides for 24, 36 hours until they got their systems uninfected. But every point of sale system in their environment where you go buy your tickets, every one of those was infected and basically was locked out at that point. So, what are some of the other innovations in marketing that criminals perpetrate? Well, in December last year, we started seeing these. You would get the CryptoLocker, and they would say, send $1,000 in Bitcoin to this address, and they would provide that, and then we'll send you keys. But they said, oh, by the way, if you don't want to pay the money, all you have to do is refer 2 of your friends, and if we can do this to 2 of your friends, we'll give you the keys for free. And a fascinating innovation, but if you take the moral aspects out of the enterprise what you see is rather innovative entrepreneurial techniques to increase market share, and yet in this case with negative consequences to us because it's the core business here is theft. So. Lastly, Tor, Freenode, I2P, anonymization networks provide tremendous value if you think of if you think of the political upheaval around the world, and if you think about dissidents having an avenue to communicate what's happening in their country, from any number of things, anonymization networks are essential to their health and safety and in many cases their lives. But anonymization also provides a great opportunity for the criminal who doesn't want anyone to be able to find them. So in Tor and Freenode, and these are actually out of the Onion router networks, technology that was actually developed by a particular government organization originally, so that they could have an environment in which they could share intelligence amongst their people in a sea of other activity, meaning you and me should you use Tor. Anyway, there's a service in Tor called Grams, and Grams is kind of the Google of the Onion network. The Tor network is not searchable in the same way. Thank you. The Tor network is not searchable in the same way the normal network is. So they there's a bunch of ways they get information, but nonetheless, if you want to find various services, you want to find various things out there, you can use Grams, do a search just like you do in Google, and they'll bring back what they have. They also have a market comparison. So if you think of any of the shopping sites you go on, you get reputation for all of the various vendors and people on there. In the same way, you can get reputation of networks that provide you everything from opioids, stolen credentials, counterfeit money, arms. You can rent hackers, you can rent services to attack businesses. There's any number of things that you can do in a marketplace that looks very much like the normal internet. So closing up, this is actually a good statistic for finance in a certain sense, and that is last year we saw 22 significant breaches that were reported in the internet. The overall number of records, that's not a good number, 204 million, but nonetheless, in aggregate, if you look at the impact of financial services, what you see, to me, the interpretation is that financial services, because of a risk-reward mentality, are much better at controlling risks than businesses that aren't engaged in finance, and that's really, I think, what that reflects. One of the key statistics about the industry, however, is where are the attacks coming from? How are they being perpetrated? And what we found last year is the rise of malicious insiders, that architect, that product manager, that whoever you hired in your company that may have come in with malicious intent, or they may have developed it, but they're actually acting against you in the organization. We saw that activity increase 5%. But what is a more significant number, the inadvertent actor, the accident, the misconfiguration, I pushed the wrong button, the impact to those breaches that we're seeing increased 53%. And this is something that is completely controllable. Completely is probably too broad a term. But this is something that you can actually attack from a risk standpoint, identifying the kinds of human activity in your environment that lead to leakages and breach. So how should we then live? What are your assets? It's not about protecting everything, right? At the bank, you don't put every teller behind a vault with their drawer, right? You reduce the risk by the amount of money they have in front of them. But you spend a lot of money to take the highest value assets in that organization, you put it in a vault, and you put a significant amount of security in it. The key is knowing what are your valuable assets, and it is amazing when you look at an organization when they can't tell you what those are or where they are. Key requirement to reducing risk. Identify your key assets and then look at how you can protect them. How are they used? How are they exposed? Who can get to them? Who do you provide access to, and who may have access that shouldn't? Who wants to get at those assets from competitors, state actors, espionage, etc. And then, most importantly, is who are your friends in your community, in your business, in related businesses with whom you can collaborate and openly share and talk about the kinds of risks that you have and how together you can confront those things against a group and organized groups that are interested in taking your assets. And then in closing, we look at trend reports. I don't predict the future. I don't believe you can predict the future. But why are trends important? They give us an indication about the kinds of things we have. And as human beings, we believe what's been going on will continue to go on until it doesn't. The point is that we look at those things backwards, but we have to look at strategies from today, regardless of where we're at, how mature or immature we are, how we go forward. And that is the most important thing that we need to look at going forward. And with that, Lars?
Great. Thank you, Ron. All right, let's see. How are we doing in terms of time there? Okay? A couple of minutes. Great. So do we have some questions, Frederick?
Thanks, Ron. Frederick Thorsen from SEB. Just to take, going from the trends you just presented and kind of looking at what IBM is doing, what type of products are you seeing especially high demand for currently? Where are your R&D resources being allocated in order to meet these new or increasing threats, or the shift from financial to more state actors, and where does smart network interface cards fit in?
Let me start with the last question first, and I'll see if I can remember one or two of the other ones. Visibility. So I described for general users and for technical users, the visibility we have into the communication that's actually happening on the internet is typically very small until we look at it. The place where technology, and especially hardware technology, despite the fact that we're moving to the cloud, there's still hardware there, right? Everybody kind of gets that. The smart networking technology is important because increasingly being able to extract, analyze, and manipulate visibility requires smart technology that we haven't used previously. What I mean is the processes that have the ability to parse the activity, parse the metadata, parse content, be able to get an understanding of what kind of traffic is flowing, where it's coming from, who's engaged, is exceedingly compute intensive, number one. And number two, at a network level, the ability to be able to, in hardware, where that information is traversing, like a network card, the ability to be able to apply parallel processes across that to extract that information and create intelligence in real time requires smarter technology than has typically been available. So where we see network technology enabling that is in what is called smart technology, smart NICs, which enable significantly more surface, if you will, to apply analytics to be able to extract that information in real time. When you think about state actors and government actors, states have virtually unlimited budgets. They say they're limited, but if you look at the spending and if you look at the growth in the government sector, despite what the economy does, you know that they have the ability to take resources and apply it. And this particular area is a tremendous growth area. We see it both in the evidence in the reports, and we also see it in the activity and in the business activity of acquiring the technology which enables that. And that hardware technology is a key to that, enabling the software that actually does the analytics, et cetera. And I probably missed your other two questions, or three, or four.
Okay, we'll allow one more question.
Thanks. Just using the opportunity while you're here. In terms of safe neighborhoods, do you believe that the internet is becoming more layered going forward? That you're creating the sense of safe neighborhood for known players? One. Secondly, are we going to see more DPI from a lot of players out there, both the ISPs as well as state actors?
DPI?
Deep packet inspection.
Oh yes.
Okay. As well as lastly, are we going to see increased sophistication in the home user devices that are most typically breached with respect to intrusion detection systems?
So going backwards from the last one, yeah, we see that. Smart light bulbs. 10 years ago, who would have thought of having a chip in a light bulb that talked to the internet? I mean, really. And now it's becoming commonplace and broad, and there's this window of a tremendous amount of devices there, and we don't really understand the consequences of those. Some of them we've seen in terms of how we start to control that. So that isn't going to slow down probably ever. The second to last question, with respect to deep packet inspection. Deep packet inspection is essential to that visibility, right? So, and we do that, in our devices, we do that at clearly a hardware level, and to get the speeds and the analysis back, you have to be able to do it. You have to be able to do it from the hardware, or it certainly has to be hardware enabled, absolutely critical. And then the first question, I think I'm...
Layered networks, safe neighborhoods.
Safe neighborhoods. So, I don't want to say increasingly, the techniques to enable that have been available a long time. I'll make one mention that sort of touches on that, right? So people say, what do I do about IoT, and I've got my business systems? The short answer is you partition the networks. You don't, I would not, in my home, I won't tell you how many devices I have floating around, but the point is anything that looks like IoT doesn't touch my critical infrastructure in that environment. It's just partitioned, and it's configuration requirement, et cetera. The trick is, and when we see that the amount of vulnerability and breach that occurs as a consequence of misconfiguration, separating your safe neighborhoods from your unsafe neighborhoods, in some cases isn't understood. In some cases, it's not as simple as a consumer needs it to be. For their environment, and then thirdly, people make mistakes in those. But we see increasing enclaves and sufficient sophistication or understanding of how to enable that for safe neighborhoods for particular activity.
Great. Again, thank you, Ron.
Thank you.